Close your eyes and picture a knight. You see gleaming armor catching sunlight, a sword raised high, banners snapping in the wind, a hero charging into battle, defending the innocent, winning glory for his name. This is the knight of legend, the knight of stories and songs, the knight who never truly existed. The reality was something else entirely. For every famous knight whose name echoed through history, there were hundreds who lived and died in obscurity. Men who spent more time collecting rents than fighting battles, who knew the weight of armor, not from tournaments, but from long, uncomfortable hours standing guard, who understood that honor was a word spoken easily by those who never had to maintain it through winters of hunger and summers of disease. This is not the story of King Arthur or Richard the Lionheart. This is the story of the average knight, the forgotten man, the one who did his duty, maintained his equipment, served his lord, and hoped to survive long enough to pass something on to his sons. This is about the routine, the obligation, the grinding reality of a life defined not by glory, but by survival. Most knights never saw a great battle. Most never rescued anyone. Most lived quiet lives, punctuated by brief moments of violence, long stretches of boredom, and the constant awareness that their world could collapse at any moment. They were not heroes. They were men doing a job. And that job was harder, stranger, and more mundane than any legend would have you believe. The medieval world was not the romantic place we imagine. It was cold, brutal, and unforgiving. Life expectancy was short. Violence was common. Disease was everywhere. And in the middle of this chaos were knights, men trained from childhood to fight and serve, but who spent most of their lives simply trying to survive the grinding reality of their obligations. Understanding the average knight means abandoning everything you think you know. It means setting aside the tales of round tables and dragon slaying. It means looking at the actual historical record, the account books, the letters, the archaeological evidence of how people really lived. And what that evidence shows is a life of extraordinary hardship, punctuated by moments of terror and long stretches of mind-numbing routine. The knight you are about to meet is not special. He is not the hero of any song. His name, whatever it was, has been lost to time along with thousands of others just like him. But his life, reconstructed from the fragments we have, tells us more about the reality of the medieval world than any legend ever could. This is what life was actually like. Chapter 1. Becoming a knight. Knighthood was not something you chose. It was something you were born toward, trained for, and if you were fortunate, eventually granted. Most knights came from minor nobility, families with land but little wealth, status but limited power. They were the second sons of lords, the cousins of barons, the nephews of knights, who needed someone to carry on a name that would otherwise be forgotten. Your path was decided before you could walk. He needed to understand that his personal feelings were secondary to his obligations. He needed to be shaped into something useful. The journey to your new home was often the last time you would see your family for years. Your mother might weep. Your father would be stern, reminding you of your duty, telling you not to bring shame on the family name. Your siblings, if you had any, would watch you go with expressions you could not read, and then you would ride away, a small child on a horse, heading toward a life you could not yet imagine. Arrival at your new lord's household was overwhelming. The castle or manor was larger than anything you had known. There were dozens of people, all with roles and relationships you did not understand. You were shown to the quarters you would share with other pages, given a pallet to sleep on, told the rules you were expected to follow, and then you were put to work. This was not education in the modern sense. It was servitude with the promise of something more. The boy would learn to serve at table, to carry messages, to tend horses, to keep his mouth shut and his eyes open. He learned etiquette, the proper way to address his betters, the correct posture for standing in the presence of nobility. He learned to ride, though at first only simple tasks, walking a horse to water, brushing its coat, cleaning its hooves. The work was constant. You woke before dawn and worked until you were told to stop. You carried water, emptied chamber pots, cleaned stables, served meals, ran messages from one part of the castle to another. Your hands became rough. Your body grew stronger. You learned to endure discomfort without complaint, because complaining changed nothing. Obedience was the first lesson and the most important one. A page who questioned orders would not advance. A page who showed pride would be humbled quickly. This was a world built on hierarchy, and your place in it was determined by birth and reinforced by discipline. You learned to do what you were told, when you were told, without hesitation or question. This was not just about respect. It was about survival. In battle, a moment of hesitation could mean death. Obedience had to be instinctive. Punishment for failure was swift and physical. A page who made mistakes was beaten. Not brutally, usually, but enough to hurt, enough to remember. You learned to be careful, to pay attention, to anticipate what would be needed before being asked. You learned to read faces and moods, to know when to speak and when to stay silent. These skills would serve you for the rest of your life, but there were also moments of kindness. An older page might show you how to do something properly. A servant might save you extra bread. The Lord's wife might speak gently to you when you served at table. These moments were rare enough to be treasured, common enough to keep you going through the hardship. You were also educated, though not in the way a modern person would understand. You learned letters, enough to read basic documents and write simple messages. You learned numbers, enough to keep accounts. You learned languages, if your lord required it, usually French alongside your native tongue. But most of your education was practical. How to care for equipment, how to prepare a horse, how to serve properly, how to fight. Around 14, if the boy had proven himself useful and obedient, he would become a squire. This was advancement, but it was also the beginning of harder work. A squire served a knight directly, often one knight specifically, becoming responsible for that man's life in ways both mundane and critical. He maintained armor, polishing away rust, checking straps, oiling joints. He sharpened weapons, repaired damaged equipment, and ensured that when his knight needed something, it was ready. The relationship between a knight and his squire was complex. It was master and servant, but also mentor and student. A good knight would teach his squire everything he knew: how to fight, how to survive, how to navigate the complicated social world of nobility. A bad knight would simply use his squire as unpaid labor and teach him nothing. You hoped for a good knight. You adapted to whatever you got. As a squire, you accompanied your knight everywhere, to battles, to tournaments if he participated in them, to courts, to meetings with other nobles. You stood behind him at meals. You slept near him in case he needed something in the night. life was not your own. It belonged to him, and through him, to his Lord. You also began learning combat, though slowly and carefully. Swordsmanship was taught through repetition, hours of practice swings, controlled sparring with blunted weapons, instruction in footwork and balance. A squire learned to fight on horseback, to control a mount with his knees while holding a lance, to absorb the shock of impact without being thrown. He learned that combat was not graceful. It was exhausting, terrifying, and over quickly. Training was painful. You were hit. You fell. You made mistakes that could have been fatal in real combat. Your body was covered in bruises. Your muscles ached constantly. But you improved. Slowly, over years, you became competent. Not skilled, perhaps, but capable enough to survive. That was all that mattered. You also learned the business side of being a knight. How to manage land if you were fortunate enough to have any. How to collect rents. How to settle disputes. How to maintain relationships with other noble families. A knight was not just a warrior. He was an administrator, a judge, a landowner, a political actor. You needed to understand all of these roles. Knighthood was not guaranteed. Some squires never advanced. They served for years and remained squires, eventually taking other roles, becoming stewards or men-at-arms, or fading into obscurity. Others died before they could be knighted, killed in battle or by disease or in accidents. The path to knighthood was long and difficult, and many did not complete it. For those who did advance, the ceremony of knighthood marked a transition into adulthood and obligation. The dubbing was often simple. You knelt before your lord. A sword touched to each shoulder. Words were spoken, an oath required. You swore to serve faithfully, to uphold certain ideals, to fulfill your obligations. And then you stood, no longer a squire but a knight. The oath you took was binding in ways that are hard to explain to a modern person. It was not symbolic. It was a real contract, enforced by everyone around you. Breaking it meant losing everything. Your land, your status, your relationships, your future. You were bound by your word, and that word defined the rest of your life. Some ceremonies were elaborate, with feasting and celebration. Others were done quickly, in the field before a battle, because knights were needed immediately. The ceremony itself mattered less than what came after. You are now responsible for your own equipment, your own reputation, your own survival. And from that moment forward, your life was no longer entirely your own. You were part of a system that had existed for generations and would continue after you were gone. You were a small piece in a vast machine of obligation and service. Your individual desires, your personal happiness, your private dreams, all of these were secondary to your duty. You had been trained for this. You had been shaped for this. And now, you would live it until you died. Chapter 2. Daily life in peacetime. The reality that surprised most new knights was this. You spent most of your time not fighting. Months would pass, sometimes years, without drawing a sword in anger. Peacetime was not rest. It was a different kind of work, less dramatic, but no less demanding. Most knights lived on small estates or in castles, serving a lord. If you had land, you oversaw it directly. This meant knowing your peasants by name, understanding crop rotations, ensuring that rents were collected and justice was administered. Disputes arose constantly. Boundaries between fields, accusations of theft, arguments over dowries and inheritances. As a knight, you were expected to settle these matters. You were the law in your small corner of the world. The estate was not large, perhaps a few hundred acres, a village, some farmland. It was enough to support you if managed properly, but barely. One bad harvest could mean hardship. Two bad harvests could mean disaster. You watched the weather constantly. Too much rain meant flooded fields. Too little meant drought. You worried about pests, about disease in the livestock, about whether your stores would last through winter. Your peasants were not slaves, but they were not free either. They owed you labor, a certain number of days per year, working your land in exchange for the right to farm their own plots. They owed you a portion of their harvest. They owed you respect and obedience. In return, you owed them protection and justice. This arrangement had existed for generations. Everyone knew their role. Managing these relationships required constant attention. You needed to be firm enough that people respected you, but not so harsh that they rebelled or fled. You needed to collect what was owed without taking so much that your peasants could not survive. You needed to settle disputes fairly, or at least fairly enough that both sides accepted the decision. This was harder than it sounds. Justice was rough and immediate. If someone stole, you might have them flogged or put in stocks. If someone committed a serious crime, you might hang them or send them to your lord for judgment. There were no trials in the modern sense, no lawyers, no presumption of innocence. You listened to accusations, made a decision, and enforced it. People accepted this because there was no alternative. If you served in a castle, your duties were different but no less tedious. You stood guard, sometimes for hours, watching empty roads for threats that never came. The boredom was crushing. You stood in armor or without it, depending on the situation, watching nothing happen. Your mind wandered. You thought about everything and nothing. Time moved slowly. When your shift ended, you were exhausted despite having done nothing. You attended your lord at meals, standing while he ate, ready to serve if needed. This was both honor and burden. You were close to power, visible to important people, part of the inner circle. But you were also decoration, standing for hours while others ate, unable to sit or relax, performing a role that had no real purpose beyond displaying your lord's status. You accompanied him on hunts, on visits to neighboring estates, on inspections of fortifications. These were opportunities to see beyond your normal routine, but they were also work. You had to be alert, presentable, ready to respond to whatever was needed. Hunts, in particular, were exhausting. They lasted all day, riding through forests, chasing animals that often escaped, returning muddy and tired, with little to show for the effort. You were decoration and protection both, a symbol of his power and the last line of defense if that power was challenged. This dual role was constant. You were never just a warrior. You were never just a servant. You were always both, navigating the complicated space between the two. Equipment maintenance was constant and unavoidable. Armor rusted, leather dried and cracked. Metal needed oil. Fabric needed mending. A knight who neglected his equipment would find himself defenseless when it mattered. So you spent hours in repetitive care, working oil into chainmail link by link, checking every strap and buckle, replacing anything that showed wear. The work was meditative in its way. Your hands moved automatically, performing tasks you had done thousands of times. Your mind drifted. You thought future. You worried. You planned. You remembered. And all the while your hands worked, keeping your equipment functional, keeping yourself ready for whatever might come. Training continued, though not intensely. A few times a week, you would practice with other knights or men-at-arms. Sparring was brief and controlled. The goal was to maintain skill, not to injure. Injuries meant you could not fulfill your duties, and that was unacceptable. You practiced specific techniques, drilled movements until they were automatic, kept your body in condition for combat that might never come. You rode regularly to keep yourself and your horse in condition. Riding was not just recreation, it was essential skill maintenance. Your horse needed to respond to your commands instantly. You needed to be comfortable in the saddle for hours at a time. You practiced mounting and dismounting in armor, controlling your horse with your knees, while your hands held weapons, riding in formation with others. These skills atrophied quickly if not maintained. You lifted weights when possible, though not in the modern sense. You swung heavy weapons. You carried armor. You did work that kept your muscles strong. Physical fitness was not about appearance. It was about survival. A weak night was a dead night. Meals were simple and repetitive. Bread was the foundation of every meal, supplemented by cheese, vegetables, occasionally meat. The bread was rough, dark, often going stale within a day. You ate it anyway. Cheese was stored in salt or wax to preserve it. Vegetables were whatever was in season, boiled or baked, rarely fresh. Meat was a luxury, usually reserved for special occasions or when an animal had to be slaughtered. The feasts of legend were rare, reserved for important occasions like holidays or visits from important nobles. Most nights, you ate what was available and went to bed early. Candles were expensive. Firelight was dim. When the sun set, there was little to do but sleep or sit in near darkness, talking quietly with others, or simply waiting for morning. Conversation filled the evening hours. You talked with other knights, with servants, with whoever was around. The same stories were told repeatedly. Jokes were worn thin through overuse. Gossip was exchanged, embellished, passed along. This was how information moved in your world. Letters were rare and expensive. Most news came through conversation, traveling from person to person, changing slightly with each telling. You played games sometimes. Dice, chess if someone had a board. Simple gambling with whatever you could wager. These diversions helped pass the time, but were not particularly enjoyable. They were just something to do, a way to fill the hours between sunset and sleep. Life followed the seasons with rigid predictability. Spring meant planting and preparation. The fields had to be worked. Equipment had to be readied in case of summer campaigns. You inspected your armor, repaired any damage from winter storage, ensured everything was functional. You trained more intensively, shaking off the rust of winter, preparing for possible combat. Summer meant potential campaigns if your lord was called to war. Even if you did not fight, summer was the busiest time. Harvests had to be supervised. Taxes collected. Disputes settled. The days were long and exhausting. You worked from dawn until dark, falling into bed, too tired to think. Autumn meant harvest and ensuring you had enough stores for winter. This was critical. Everything depended on having sufficient food to last until spring. You counted sacks of grain, barrels of preserved vegetables, smoked meat, anything that could be stored, You calculated, worried, hoped it would be enough. Sometimes it was not. Winter meant enduring cold, rationing food, and hoping everyone survived until spring. The rhythm was predictable, and that predictability was both comforting and suffocating. You knew what was coming. You could prepare for it, but you could not escape it. Year after year, the same cycle repeated. Spring, summer, autumn, winter. Birth, growth, harvest, survival. Over and over until you died. The routine was broken occasionally by events. A wedding, a funeral, a visit from traveling entertainers, a messenger with news from elsewhere. These moments were treasured precisely because they were different, but they were exceptions. Most of your life was ordinary, repetitive, grinding routine. And in that routine, you learned something important. Glory was rare, comfort was rare, excitement was rare. What was common, what defined your existence, was obligation. You did your duty because it was your duty. You served because you had sworn to serve. You endured because there was no alternative. This was the reality of peacetime. Not rest, not ease, but a different kind of war. A war against boredom, against poverty, against the slow erosion of equipment and will. You fought this war every day, and every day you survived it. That was enough. Chapter 3. Armor, weapons, and maintenance. Your equipment defined your status and your survival. Without it, you were not a knight. You were just a man who once wore armor. The relationship between a knight and his equipment was intimate, practical, and absolutely essential. Armor was expensive beyond what most people can imagine. A full set of quality mail could cost more than a peasant would see in a lifetime of work. Plate armor, when it existed and where it was available, was ruinously expensive, affordable only by the wealthiest knights and lords. Most knights owned their armor personally. Often, it had been inherited from a father or uncle, adjusted to fit, repaired over years of use. Losing your armor meant debt, shame, and potentially the end of your career as a knight. The cost was not just an acquisition. Maintaining armor required constant investment. You needed oil to prevent rust, leather to replace worn straps, metal rings to repair chainmail, padding to protect your body from the weight and friction of the armor itself. These costs accumulated. A knight on a limited income might spend a third of what he had just keeping his equipment functional. The weight was constant and crushing. Chainmail alone could weigh 40 pounds or more. Add padding underneath, a helmet, gloves, and you were carrying half your body weight in metal and leather. Some knights wore additional protection, more layers, heavier pieces. The weight distributed across your body, but it was always there. Every movement required extra effort. Every step was harder. You learned to move in it, to fight in it, but you never stopped feeling it. The pressure on your shoulders, where the mail hung, the way it pulled at your neck, the heat it trapped against your body in summer, the cold it held in winter. Armor was protection, but it was also burden. You accepted this because the alternative was being unprotected. At the end of a long day, removing armor was relief so profound it was almost painful. You felt lighter, freer, able to move without resistance. Your body ached from the weight it had carried. Red marks showed where straps had pressed into flesh. You were exhausted in ways that had nothing to do with what you had actually done. Simply, wearing armor was work. Maintenance was daily and non-negotiable. Rust was the enemy, constant and patient. A single night of rain could leave spots of corrosion that would spread if not addressed immediately. You cleaned your armor after every use, working oil into the metal, wiping away moisture, checking for damage. This took hours. Every link of chainmail had to be inspected. Every piece of plate had to be cleaned and oiled. Every strap checked for wear. Chainmail required special attention. Individual links could break from stress or corrosion. A broken link weakened the entire section. Replacing them was painstaking work. You had to open the broken link, remove it, insert a new one, close it properly. Each repair took time. A suit of mail might need dozens of repairs after a single battle. You did this work yourself because you could not afford to pay someone else. The padding underneath the mail was equally important. It absorbed impact, prevented the metal from grinding against your skin, distributed weight more evenly. But padding absorbed sweat, accumulated dirt, and wore out. You had to clean it, repair it, replace it entirely when it became too damaged. This was less expensive than the metal, but still costly in time and materials. Weapons were tools, not decorations. They were meant to be functional, reliable, effective. Appearance was secondary to performance. A beautiful sword that broke in combat was worthless. An ugly spear that never failed was invaluable. You learned this quickly. Swords, despite their prominence in legend, were often a secondary weapon. They were expensive to make, requiring skilled craftsmen and quality metal. They required significant skill to use effectively, years of training to master. And they broke more easily than you might expect. Metal can only take so much stress before it fails. A sword that struck armor at the wrong angle could bend or shatter. Once damaged, repair was difficult and expensive. Most knights used swords as backup weapons or for specific situations. In open battle, other weapons were more practical. But a sword was still important. It was a symbol of your status. It could be used in close quarters, where longer weapons were impractical. And if everything else failed, it was what you had left. Spears and lances were far more common in actual combat. They had reach, keeping enemies at distance. They were effective against horses and riders. They could be used from horseback with devastating effect. And they were relatively easy to replace if damaged. A broken spear could be repaired, or a new one made by any competent carpenter. A broken sword required a blacksmith and significant expense. You learned to fight with whatever worked, not what looked impressive. In training, you practiced with multiple weapon types: spear, lance, sword, mace, axe, dagger. Each had advantages in different situations. A knight who relied on a single weapon was limiting himself dangerously. You needed versatility. The lance was your primary weapon on horseback. It was long, heavy, designed to deliver maximum force at the moment of impact. Couching a lance under your arm, controlling your horse with your knees, aiming for an enemy while they did the same to you. This required skill and nerve. The impact was violent. Lances shattered regularly. You needed multiple lances for any significant engagement. Maces and axes were effective against armor. Blades could glance off metal. Blunt force could not be deflected as easily. A mace could crush bone through mail. An axe could hook and pull, opening gaps in defense. These weapons were brutal, but effective. You used them when you had to. Daggers were essential. They were used for eating, for cutting rope, for general utility. In combat, they were last resort weapons. for close fighting. If you were grappling with an enemy, a dagger could find gaps in armor that larger weapons could not reach. Every knight carried a dagger. Many carried multiple ones. Horses were perhaps your most valuable asset, more expensive than armor, more expensive than weapons, more expensive than everything else combined. A trained war horse could cost as much as a small estate. These were not the massive destriers of legend. Those horses were rare, and even more expensive. Most were strong, steady animals, trained to tolerate chaos and obey even. The animal needed food, water, exercise, grooming, hoof care. Horses were prone to injury and illness. A lame horse was useless. A sick horse could die suddenly, taking your investment with it. You learned basic veterinary care by necessity. You knew how to treat common problems, when to seek help, how to prevent issues before they started. Tack and harness needed as much maintenance as armor. Leather dried and cracked. Stitching came loose. Metal fittings corroded or broke. You repaired everything constantly, keeping your horse's equipment functional. A broken stirrup or failed girth at the wrong moment could be fatal. Readiness mattered more than appearance. A knight with perfect, gleaming armor, who had not maintained his sword properly, could die in the first moments of combat. A knight with battered, worn equipment, who knew every weakness and strength of what he carried, would survive. You learned this quickly, or you did not survive long enough for it to matter. You developed relationships with your equipment, not sentimental attachment, but practical familiarity. You knew exactly how your armor fit, where it rubbed, how to adjust it for comfort. You knew the balance of your weapons, which ones you preferred, how they felt in your hand. You knew your horse's personality, its quirks, what calmed it when frightened. This familiarity was survival. In combat, you could not afford to think about your equipment. It had to work automatically. Your armor had to fit properly. Your weapons had to be where you expected them. Your horse had to respond to commands instantly. All of this required constant maintenance and practice. Equipment failure killed knights regularly. A strap that broke at the wrong moment. Armor that had rusted through in a spot you had not checked. A weapon that failed when you needed it. These were not dramatic deaths. They were stupid, preventable deaths, the result of neglecting maintenance that you knew. So you maintained everything. You spent hours doing boring, repetitive work, because that work kept you alive. You resented it sometimes, the endless cycle of cleaning and repairing and replacing, but you did it anyway, because the alternative was dying, and dying for lack of maintenance was the stupidest way to go. Chapter 4, Warfare and Campaigns. When war came, it came with little warning and less glory. You would receive word that your lord was called to campaign. You had days, maybe a week, to prepare. Drop everything. Settle your affairs. Gather your equipment. Say goodbye to your family without knowing if you would return. And then ride out to join the gathering army. Wars were seasonal for practical reasons. Armies could not march in winter. Mud made roads impassable. Cold made soldiers sick. Food was scarce, foraged from a landscape that produced nothing. So campaigns happened in late spring through early autumn, when weather allowed movement, and crops could feed an army. Even then, the logistics were brutal, and often determined outcomes more than any battle. A campaign began with a summons carried by messenger. Your lord needed you. You were obligated to answer. This was not optional. Refusing meant breaking your oath, losing your land, becoming an outcast. So you went, regardless of personal circumstances, regardless of whether your estate could spare you, regardless of fear or reluctance or any other feeling. You gathered your equipment, checking everything one final time. Armor, weapons, horse, supplies. You packed what you could carry. Food for several days, knowing it would not be enough. Extra straps and buckles for repairs. Oil for your armor. Anything you might need and could physically transport. Everything else had to be left behind. Leaving was harder than you expected every time. Your wife, if you had one, tried to be strong. Your children, if they were old enough to understand, looked at you with fear. Your peasants watched you ride away, knowing that if you died, their lives would be disrupted too. Everyone pretended it would be fine. Everyone knew it might not be. The gathering itself took weeks. Knights and men-at-arms arrived from different estates and regions. Lords arrived with their retinues. Supplies were organized, or failed to be organized properly. Plans were made, changed, argued over endlessly. By the time the army actually moved, you had already been away from home for longer than you wanted. The army was chaos. Thousands of men with different lords, different languages sometimes, different ideas about how things should work. Knights considered themselves superior to common soldiers. Common soldiers resented knights. Everyone competed for limited resources. Arguments broke out constantly. Fights were common. Discipline was maintained through force and fear. The march itself was exhausting. 15 or 20 miles a day if the road was good, sometimes less if it was not. You rode in armor or with it packed on your horse, both options uncomfortable. In armor, you dealt with the weight and heat. Packed, you worried about it being damaged or stolen. There was no good choice. The column stretched for miles. Knights rode near the front, usually, with their retinues around them. Men-at-arms marched in formation. Foot soldiers struggled to keep pace. Supply wagons moved slowly, holding up everyone behind them. Camp followers, women and children and merchants, trailed along seeking safety and opportunity. The whole mass moved like a sluggish river, slow and barely controlled. Dust choked you in dry weather. Every horse, every foot soldier, every wagon kicked up more dust. It hung in the air, got in your eyes and mouth and throat. You breathed it constantly. Your lungs hurt. Your eyes watered. You wrapped cloth around your face, but it barely helped. When it rained, the dust became mud. Thick, clinging mud that sucked at hooves and wheels. Horses struggled. Wagons got stuck. Progress slowed to a crawl. Men pushed wagons free, cursing, exhausted, knowing it would happen again in an hour. At night, you made camp wherever the army stopped. If you were fortunate, you had a tent. Most nights did, though they were not large or comfortable. Just enough space to sleep out of the weather. If you were not fortunate, you slept on the ground, wrapped in whatever you had, hoping it would not rain. Sleep was difficult. The ground was hard. Noise was constant. You were always on edge, aware that enemy scouts might be watching, that attack was possible. Food became an obsession almost immediately. Armies carried supplies, but never enough. The logistics of feeding thousands of men were nearly impossible. Supplies ran out. Wagons fell behind. Rationing began almost immediately. You ate less than you wanted, less than you needed. Hunger became your constant companion. Foraging was organized chaos. Soldiers were sent out to find food in the surrounding countryside. They took everything they found: peasant stores, livestock, crops still in the field, anything edible. Theoretically, this was supposed to be controlled, documented, paid for eventually. In practice, it was barely organized theft. Soldiers took what they wanted. Villages were stripped bare. Local people hid what they could or fled entirely. You participated in this because you had to eat. You rationalized it as necessity, as the cost of war that everyone understood. But you saw the faces of people whose food you took. You heard mothers begging you to leave something for the children. You did it anyway, because the alternative was starving yourself. Soldiers fought over food regularly. Small disputes escalated quickly when everyone was hungry. Men would steal from each other, from other units, from anywhere they could. Trust broke down. You guarded your rations, slept with them near you, ate quickly before someone could take them. This was not paranoia. This was reality. Disease killed more men than combat. And it was not even close. Dysentery was constant, spreading through camps where thousands of men lived in close quarters with inadequate sanitation. Men suffered in ways that destroyed dignity. They weakened rapidly, unable to keep food down, dehydrated, dying slowly and miserably. There was no treatment. You either recovered on your own or you did not. Fever struck randomly. One day a man was fine. The next he was burning up, delirious, unable to stand. Sometimes it passed. Often it did not. Bodies were left behind or buried quickly in shallow graves that animals would dig up. The army could not stop for the sick. It could barely stop at all. You marched or you were left behind to die alone. Infections from minor wounds turned serious regularly. A small cut ignored became red and swollen. Then it began to smell. Then the man was feverish and dying. There was no understanding of germs or infection. Wounds were treated with whatever seemed to help. Usually nothing helped. Men died from injuries that would be trivial today. The army left a trail of sick and dying behind it. Men too weak to continue were left at monasteries or villages, if any would take them. Most were simply abandoned by the roadside. Some recovered and made their way home eventually. Most did not. Their bodies rotted where they fell. One more casualty of a war they barely participated in. Battles, when they happened, were brief and chaotic after all that preparation and suffering. Armies maneuvered for days or weeks, trying to find advantageous positions. Scouts watched for enemy movements. Commanders argued about strategy. And then suddenly the two sides were in position, and the fighting began. The night before battle was the worst. You knew it was coming. You prepared your equipment one more time, checking everything obsessively. You confessed, if a priest was available, trying to ensure your soul was prepared. You tried to sleep, but could not. You lay awake, thinking about death, about pain, about whether you would be brave enough when the moment came. Morning brought relief, just from ending the waiting. You ate if you could stomach food. You dressed in your armor with help from your squire or other knights. You mounted your horse, and then you moved into position with your unit, waiting for the signal to advance. The charge was the moment everything focused down to pure physical experience. You rode forward with dozens of other knights, horses in formation, lances ready. The ground shook from the pounding of hooves. The noise was overwhelming. And then you saw the enemy doing the same thing riding toward you, lances aimed, and you had seconds to brace for impact. The collision was violent beyond description. Lances struck shields, armor, sometimes bodies. The sound was deafening. Horses collided or swerved. Men fell. Lances shattered. You were through the enemy line or you were in the middle of it, surrounded. And then it was just chaos. Close combat on horseback was confusion and terror. You tried to maintain awareness of where you were, where your allies were, where threats came from. You swung your weapon at anyone in enemy colors. You protected yourself from strikes you barely saw coming. Everything happened too fast to think. You reacted on instinct and training, hoping it was enough. If the charge succeeded, if the enemy line broke, they fled. You pursued if ordered, cutting down men running away, trying to capture knights who were worth ransom. If the charge failed, you were the one running, trying to get away before you were surrounded and killed or captured. Either way, the actual fighting lasted minutes, maybe an hour. Nothing like the prolonged battles of legend. Afterwards was surreal. The battlefield was covered in bodies, wounded men, dead and dying horses. The noise changed from combat to screaming. Wounded men cried for help. Horses screamed. A sound that haunted you forever. You were exhausted, shaken from fear and exertion, trying to process what had just happened. If you survived uninjured, you helped search for wounded from your side. Men with manageable injuries were treated. Men with serious injuries were given mercy or left to die. Captured enemies were secured. Dead enemies were looted for anything useful. This was not cruelty. This was practicality. The dead did not need their equipment. You might. Captured knights were valuable. A knight could be ransomed back to his family. The ransom could be significant, enough to make capturing him more valuable than killing him. So during battle, you tried to force surrender rather than inflict death. You struck to disable, not to kill. You shouted offers of quarter. If a man yielded, you took him prisoner and gained a valuable asset. This was not chivalry or honor. This was economics. Dead men paid nothing. Captured men could make you wealthy. The practical incentives shaped behavior more than any ideal. You learned to see enemies as potential profit, not just threats to kill. But common soldiers had no ransom value. Fighting them was different. You killed them or they killed you. There was no taking prisoners who had nothing to pay. The class divide extended even into combat. Knights could expect quarter. Common soldiers could expect death. After battle, the army remained in the area for days, looting, organizing prisoners, treating wounded, burning, or burying the dead. This was its own kind of horror. The smell of death hung over everything. Flies swarmed. Disease spread faster. Everyone wanted to leave, but the army moved slowly, dealing with the aftermath of violence. Eventually, you marched again. If you won, you felt relief and pride and tried to ignore the fact that you survived mostly through luck. If you lost, you felt fear and shame and marched away, hoping the enemy would not pursue. Either way, you were still in campaign, still far from home, still enduring conditions that slowly destroyed everyone who experienced them. Campaigns lasted weeks or months. The return journey was as hard as the outward one, sometimes harder. Supplies were depleted. Men were wounded or sick. Morale was shattered. You marched home slowly, losing more men to disease and exhaustion every day. The army that returned was always smaller than the one that left, even if you won. finally reached home, you felt relief so profound you could barely process it. You were alive. You had survived. Your obligations were fulfilled. You dismounted, removed your armor, and tried to return to normal life, as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. You had seen things you could not unsee, done things you could not undo, and you knew that the next summons could come at any time, and you would have to do it all again. Chapter 5, Castle Life. Castles were not comfortable, and they were not meant to be. They were fortifications first, residences second. Every design choice prioritized defense over livability. The people who inhabited them adapted to discomfort as a constant condition. Stone walls, thick enough to withstand siege weapons, held cold like they were designed for it. In summer, this was sometimes welcome. The interior remained cooler than outside when the sun beat down. But in winter, those same walls became prisons of cold. They absorbed chill from the air and radiated it inward. No amount of fire could truly warm a stone castle in winter. Fires helped, but not much. The great hall had a central hearth, open to the room, venting smoke through gaps in the roof or through crude chimneys that worked poorly. Heat rose and escaped. What remained barely warmed those closest to the flames. Everyone else endured cold that made breath visible and joints ache. You learned to stay near fires whenever possible. Knights and nobles clustered around heat sources, establishing informal hierarchies based on who got closest. Servants and lower status people made do with whatever warmth they could find. In sleeping quarters, people slept in groups for warmth, sharing body heat because it was the only heat available. Frostbite was common in severe winters. Fingers and toes turned white, then black. People lost digits to cold, permanent reminders of winters they survived. Illness from cold was expected. Coughs that never quite left. Joint pain that worsened year after year. You accepted this as the price of surviving winter. Privacy was rare to the point of being almost non-existent. Most nights shared sleeping quarters with others. Rooms were small, packed with people sleeping on straw mattresses, arranged closely together. Personal space was measured in inches, not feet. Everyone heard everything. Snoring, coughing, conversations, intimate moments. All of it audible to everyone else in the room. The lack of privacy extended beyond sleeping. You dressed with others around. You ate with others watching. You could not have a private conversation without walking outside. And even then, you might be observed. Your entire life was performed in the presence of others. You learned to ignore this, or went mad from the lack of solitude. Noise was constant and inescapable. During the day, the castle was full of activity. Servants worked, their tasks generating constant sound. Blacksmiths hammered metal. Carpenters sawed wood. Animals in the courtyard made their own contributions. Chickens clucking, pigs squealing, dogs barking. Merchants came and went, shouting their wares or arguing over prices. Soldiers trained, their practice weapons clacking together, commands being shouted. Inside, the noise was different, but no less pervasive. Conversations echoed off stone walls. Footsteps on stone floors announced movement constantly. Doors opened and closed. Things were dropped. People laughed, argued, cried. The sounds layered together into a background roar that you learned to tune out but never truly escaped. At night, it was quieter, but never silent. Wind found every gap in the stone, whistling and moaning. Guards walked patrols, their footsteps regular and loud. Distant sounds from other rooms carried through the castle. people coughing or talking in their sleep, rats scratching in the walls, the creak of old wood settling. You learned to sleep through it because you had no choice. Smoke filled rooms constantly. The hearth in the great hall produced enormous amounts of smoke, venting poorly through whatever chimney existed. Torches added their own contribution, burning rushes soaked in fat, producing dim light and thick smoke. Your eyes burned constantly. Your throat was always irritated. You coughed, a deep rattling cough that everyone had, that never quite went away. You smelled of smoke constantly, so much so that you stopped noticing it on yourself. Fresh air meant going outside, which meant cold. You chose between breathing clean, cold air, or breathing warm, smoky air. Usually, you chose warmth. Your lungs paid the price over years of exposure. Beds were simple and uncomfortable. Straw mattresses laid on wooden frames or directly on stone floors. The straw compressed over time, leaving you sleeping on lumpy, uneven surfaces. Rough blankets, often wool that itched, provided some warmth, but never enough. Sometimes a pillow, if you were fortunate. Usually just more bundled cloth. You slept in your clothes for warmth, and because you had nowhere to store them anyway. Your day clothes became your night clothes. You owned few garments. What you had, you wore until it fell apart, then patched and wore some more. Changing clothes was a luxury that happened rarely. Bathing was infrequent, requiring significant effort and resources. Water had to be drawn from wells, carried to where it was needed, heated over fires. This process took hours and consumed fuel that might be needed for other purposes. Most people bathed a few times a year at most, usually in spring or summer when cold water was more tolerable. Without regular bathing, everyone smelled. Unwashed bodies, unwashed clothes, accumulated sweat and dirt. The smell was pervasive and normal. You became nose blind to it, only noticing when you encountered someone who smelled different, usually worse. Fresh travelers were identifiable by smell before sight. Hygiene was basic at best. You washed your hands and face in cold water when it was available, usually from a shared basin that everyone used. The water was rarely changed. By the time 10 people had used it, it was dirty. But you used it anyway. Teeth were cleaned with cloth rubbed over them, sometimes with salt if available. Dental problems were common and often fatal. Tooth infections could kill you. Latrines were crude, functional, unpleasant, often just holes in the outer wall that dropped waste outside, falling into moats or pits below. You sat on wooden seats worn smooth by use, exposed to cold air coming up through the hole, and did your business as quickly as possible. Privacy was minimal. Many latrines accommodated multiple people simultaneously. The smell from latrines permeated nearby areas. In summer, it was worse, attracting flies, making nearby spaces nearly unbearable. In winter, at least the cold, suppressed the smell somewhat. You learned to breathe through your mouth near latrines and to avoid spending more time there than necessary. Clean water was not guaranteed. Wells could be contaminated by latrines seeping into the water table, by dead animals, by any number of sources. Rivers carried waste from upstream settlements. You could not tell by looking whether water was safe. People drank contaminated water and got sick or died. This happened regularly. Because water was suspect, you drank ale or wine when possible. Weak ale was consumed throughout the day, even by children, because the brewing process made it safer than water. Wine was more expensive, but common enough among knights and nobles. Getting mildly drunk was normal, even expected. Sobriety meant risking disease from bad water. The castle interior was dark even during the day. Windows were small, designed to be defensible, letting in minimal light. Shutters could close them entirely, necessary for defense, but making interiors even darker. On cloudy days or in winter, with shutters closed, you moved through near darkness, navigating by memory and feel. Artificial light was expensive and inadequate. Candles were costly, reserved for important occasions or wealthy households. Torches provided more light, but consumed resources quickly and produced smoke and fire hazards. Rushlights, cheaper but dimmer, were most common. You learned to work and live in dim light that would be considered unbearable today. Comfort was secondary to defense in every aspect of castle design. Narrow windows meant cold, dark rooms, but were defensible. Thick walls meant damp interiors, but could withstand attack. High walls meant long climbs on narrow staircases, but made the castle harder to take. Spiral staircases turned clockwise going up, favoring defenders coming down, who could swing swords more easily than attackers climbing up. You accepted these design choices because the alternative was dying when attackers came. Comfort was a luxury. Survival was essential. The castle was a machine for keeping you alive during siege or attack. Everything else was secondary. Winter was especially harsh in castles. Food stores, put up during autumn harvest, had to last until spring. You rationed carefully, eating less as winter progressed, hoping supplies would last. Sometimes they did not. Late winter meant hunger, subsisting on dwindling supplies, eating things you would have rejected in better times. Illness spread rapidly in close quarters. One person sick meant everyone exposed. Colds, fevers, stomach ailments, all spread through the castle population. The very young and very old died most frequently, but anyone could succumb. You lived with the constant awareness that disease could kill you as easily as any enemy. Winter deaths were common and expected. Elderly people who survived autumn would not survive winter. Young children, especially infants, died from cold or illness. Occasionally others, struck by disease or injury that became infected. Bodies were buried when the ground thawed, if they could not be buried immediately. You waited for spring with desperation that increased as winter extended. Every week, closer to spring, was a small victory. When the weather finally broke, when you could feel warmth in the air again, the relief was profound. You had survived another winter. That was achievement enough. Life was communal by necessity, not choice. You could not be alone even if you wanted to. Your life was shared with dozens of others, their problems becoming your problems, their illnesses your risk, their moods affecting yours. You learned to navigate complex social dynamics because you could not escape them. Privacy, as a concept, barely existed. The idea of being alone, of having time and space to yourself, was alien. You were never alone. Never. You slept with others. You ate with others. You worked with others. Even defecation was semi-public. The psychological toll of this was significant but unrecognized. You adapted or went mad. The castle was your world. Most people never traveled far from it. The surrounding area, familiar from years of living there, was all you knew. The castle was center, everything else periphery. Your life revolved around its rhythms, its routines, its hierarchies. This was not imprisonment exactly, but it was confinement of a sort. Despite everything, the castle was also safety. Outside its walls was danger. raiders, wild animals, bandits, enemies. Inside was relative security, the illusion at least of control. You endured the discomfort because the alternative was exposure to threats you could not handle alone. The castle protected you. That was its purpose. That it also made you uncomfortable was simply the price you paid for that protection. Chapter 6. Social expectations and honor. Chivalry was an ideal, spoken of often, practiced seldom. The code existed in songs and stories, where knights were noble, brave, merciful, protective of the weak. Reality was more complex. Knights were human, subject to the same impulses as everyone else, but held to standards that could destroy them if violated. The code existed, but was applied selectively, interpreted to suit needs, honored in the breach as often as in observance. You learned this quickly. Some nobles embodied chivalric ideals genuinely. Most paid lip service to them while acting in self-interest. The smart ones understood that chivalry was performance, necessary performance, but performance nonetheless. Honor, as a concept, had real power. Not because people believed in it universally, but because everyone else acted as if they did. You maintained honor because losing it had immediate, tangible consequences. Dishonor meant losing alliances, opportunities, status. It meant being shunned, excluded, dismissed. Your reputation was your currency, and honor was how that reputation was measured. You owed loyalty to your lord, above all else. This was not negotiable or conditional. Your oath bound you to serve when called, to fight when ordered, to support your lord's interests, even when they conflicted with your own. The oath was sacred in ways modern minds struggle to understand. Breaking it was not just wrong, it was existentially destructive. A knight who broke his oath became nothing. No other lord would take him. His former allies would abandon him. His family would be shamed. He would be hunted or left to starve. There was no coming back from broken oaths. You knew this? Everyone knew this. The knowledge kept most people loyal, even when loyalty was difficult. But loyalty was also complicated. Lords died, heirs inherited, political situations changed. Sometimes you found yourself serving someone you had not sworn to, someone you might not respect. You adapted. Your oath was to the position, not just the person. When the person changed, the oath remained. Reputation mattered enormously in social interaction and opportunity. A knight known as reliable, competent, honorable could expect good marriages for his children. He would be given command positions in campaigns. Lords would grant him additional lands or privileges. His opinion would be sought in councils. Reputation opened doors. A knight with poor reputation found those doors closed. No one wanted to marry their daughters to him. He would be given lesser duties, excluded from important decisions, passed over for advancement. Other knights would avoid him, not wanting to be associated with someone dishonored. Reputation damage was career destruction. Once your reputation was damaged, repairing it was nearly impossible. Rumors spread faster than truth. A single failure could define you forever, regardless of previous success. You might serve faithfully for 20 years, but one moment of cowardice, real or perceived, would be what people remembered. The injustice of this was irrelevant. This was reality. You learned to guard your reputation obsessively. You avoided situations where failure was likely. You ensured witnesses observed your successes. You cultivated relationships with people who could vouch for you. You told your own story before others could tell it differently. Managing reputation was constant work. Honor affected alliances and marriage arrangements. Families known for honoring agreements were preferred partners. If your grandfather had broken an oath, it affected your prospects generations later. If your family was known for reliability, you benefited from their history. You carried your family's reputation always, for good or ill. This extended beyond immediate family. Your cousin's behavior reflected on you. Your lord's reputation colored yours. You were embedded in a web of relationships and associations, all affecting how others perceived you. You could not escape this context. It defined you as much as your own actions. Duels were far rarer than legend suggests. They were expensive, dangerous, often forbidden by lords who did not want to lose capable knights over personal disputes. The romantic idea of knights dueling over slights or ladies was mostly fiction. Reality was more constrained. When duels happened, they were formal affairs with strict rules. Both parties had to agree. Seconds negotiated terms. Witnesses observed. The combat was structured with specific weapons and conditions. The goal was not necessarily death. Sometimes, first blood ended it. Sometimes, yielding was acceptable. Sometimes, it was to the death. But that was rarer. Most conflicts were settled through negotiation, compensation, or simply ignored if not important enough to risk life over. A knight who demanded duels over every slight would not last long. You learned to tolerate insults, to find non-violent solutions, to let things go. Pride was expensive. Survival was more important. Public behavior was constantly scrutinized by peers and superiors. You spoke to your lord, who mattered. How you treated servants was observed. How you conducted yourself at meals, how you responded to insults, how you handled success or failure. All of it was judged constantly. A knight who drank too much was remembered and mocked. A knight who lost his temper was considered unstable. A knight who showed weakness was dismissed as unworthy. You learned to control yourself in public, to maintain composure regardless of what you felt. Your public face was a mask you wore constantly. In private, you could be yourself, but private moments were rare. You were almost always performing for someone. The performance became reality. Who you actually were mattered less than who you appeared to be. If you appeared honorable, you were treated as honorable, regardless of internal truth. Failures were remembered longer than successes. A knight who won 10 battles but fled from one would be known forever as a coward. A knight who served faithfully for years but failed once in an important moment would be defined by that failure. This was unfair but unchangeable. Success was expected. It was the baseline. Doing your duty successfully earned no particular recognition because that was what you were supposed to do. Only failure was exceptional. Only failure generated stories that people told repeatedly. You needed consistent success just to maintain your position. One failure could destroy everything. Violence was normalized in ways that are difficult for modern people to understand. Public executions were common entertainment. People gathered to watch criminals hanged, beheaded, burned. Children attended. Everyone treated it as normal. Death was not hidden or sanitized. It was public and visible. Punishment was often physical and public. Criminals were whipped in town squares. People were put in stocks for minor offenses, pelted with refuse by passers-by. Torture was legally sanctioned for serious crimes. You witnessed these things regularly. You became accustomed to violence. or at least to its presence. Disputes were sometimes settled with violence, even when not formally duels. Bar fights, brawls, men beating each other over disagreements. As long as no one died and it did not become a legal matter, this was tolerated. Violence was a language everyone spoke, a way of resolving things when words failed. Knights were expected to be comfortable with violence, capable of inflicting it without hesitation when required. A knight who hesitated to kill when ordered was considered weak. A knight who showed distress over violence was mocked. You learned to suppress reactions, to treat violence as a tool, no more morally significant than any other. This psychological adaptation was necessary but costly. You became someone capable of terrible things. You justified it as duty, as necessity, as simply the way things were. But you knew in quiet moments that you had crossed lines that could not be uncrossed. You lived with this knowledge or suppressed it. There were no other options. Status required constant maintenance. You could not rest on past achievements. Past success, no matter how significant, faded from memory. You had to continue proving yourself year after year until age or death removed you from consideration. The moment you stopped being useful, you were forgotten. This created constant pressure. You could never relax, never feel secure in your position. There was always someone younger, stronger, more ambitious looking to replace you. You had to remain relevant, remain valuable, remain visible. The competition never ended. Older knights faced particular challenges. Physical decline was inevitable. You became slower, weaker, more prone to injury. Your value as a warrior decreased. If you had not built other forms of value, advisory roles, or political connections, you became expendable. Age was not respected automatically. It had to be earned through continued contribution. Some transitioned successfully into advisory roles. They attended councils, offered wisdom based on experience, helped plan campaigns they no longer fought in. This was better than fighting, but still demanding. Your value was in your knowledge. The moment your advice was no longer needed, you had nothing left to offer. Others did not transition successfully. They continued trying to fight past the point where they were effective. They became liabilities, slower than enemies, unable to protect themselves properly. Some died in combat they should not have been in. Others were quietly retired, given minor tasks that kept them busy, but away from anything important. The cruelty of this system was its inevitability. Everyone aged. Everyone declined. Everyone eventually lost their value. There was no safety net, no retirement, no honor for past service that protected you from present irrelevance. You were useful until you were not, and then you were discarded. You learned not to expect fairness. The world did not operate on fair principles. It operated on utility, on power, on who could provide what. You adapted to this, or you suffered. Complaining changed nothing. Acceptance was the only viable response. Social expectations and honor codes, for all their elevation in story and song, were tools of social control. They maintained hierarchy. They enforced conformity. They ensured that people stayed in their assigned roles and did not disrupt the system. Understanding this did not free you from it. You still had to perform. You still had to maintain honor. The system was larger than any individual. Chapter 7. Religion and Belief. Religion was not something you chose. It was the framework through which you understood the world, the lens that gave meaning to everything you experienced. the church was the most powerful institution in your world, more powerful than any king, more permanent than any dynasty. You were born into it, lived within it, and would die hoping it would save your soul. Prayer was routine, as habitual as breathing. Morning prayers before starting the day, thanking God for allowing you to wake. Prayers before meals, blessing food and acknowledging its source. Evening prayers before sleep, confessing sins of the day and requesting protection through the night. Prayers before battle, asking for courage and survival. Prayers for the dead, commending their souls to God's mercy. The prayers were often rote, words repeated so many times they lost meaning, but you said them anyway. Skipping prayer was noticed. Someone would comment. Your piety was observed and judged like everything else. Even if prayer felt empty, you performed it faithfully. The alternative was social censure. Some people prayed sincerely, finding genuine comfort in communion with God. They felt presence, guidance, peace. Others performed prayer mechanically, getting nothing from it except the avoidance of criticism for not praying. Most existed somewhere between these extremes, sometimes meaning it, sometimes just going through motions. War was justified spiritually by church authorities. Your Lord fought for righteous reasons, or so the priest said. The enemy was godless or heretical, or blocking some holy purpose. You were told that dying in service to your Lord was dying in service to God. The wars themselves might have been about land or power or revenge, but they were dressed in religious language that made them feel sacred. Whether you believed this varied. Some knights were convinced of the righteousness of their cause. They fought with religious fervor, believing they did God's work. Others were more cynical, recognizing that the religious justification was convenient excuse for ambition, but you repeated the justifications regardless of belief because everyone around you did. Doubt was private, faith was public. The Crusades were the ultimate expression of warfare, sanctified by religion. Fighting to reclaim the Holy Land from Muslims was presented as the highest calling. Knights who died on crusade were promised immediate entry to heaven, all sins forgiven. This was powerful motivation for men who lived with constant awareness of their own sins. But crusades were also campaigns like any other, with the same disease, hunger, and chaos. The religious motivation did not protect you from dysentery or enemy swords. Many knights died never reaching the Holy Land. Those who did often found the reality less glorious than promised. The religious framing helped recruit warriors, but did not change the fundamental nature of warfare. Fear of damnation was real and pervasive. Hell was not metaphor or abstract concept. It was a place of eternal torment, awaiting those who sinned without repentance. Priests described it in vivid detail. Fire and suffering without end. Demons tormenting souls forever. You were reminded of hell regularly, in sermons, in art, in conversations. This fear shaped behavior significantly. You confessed regularly, not always from genuine guilt, but from fear of dying with unconfessed sins. Confession was how you managed your spiritual account, keeping it in acceptable balance. The priest would hear your sins, prescribe penance, grant absolution. Your soul was clean until you sinned again. The sins you confessed were real enough. Violence that troubled your conscience. Sexual sins, which were numerous and often unavoidable given human nature. Anger, pride, envy, all the usual human failings. Some sins were serious, others were minor. The priest decided which was which and assigned penance accordingly. Penance might be prayers, fasting, donations to the church, pilgrimage if the sin was serious enough. You performed the penance as instructed, going through the motions even if you did not feel particularly repentant. The system worked on performance, not internal state. If you performed penance properly, your sin was forgiven, regardless of whether you truly regretted it. Confession before battle was common practice, not because you expected to die specifically, but because you might. Battle was unpredictable. Anyone could die, regardless of skill or preparation. You wanted your soul as clean as possible before facing that risk. If you survived, you would sin again. If you died, you hoped you had done enough to avoid hell. Knights were expected to support the church financially. Donations, tithes, gifts of land were all expected. This was obligation, not charity. The church provided spiritual services, and you paid for them like any other service. A knight who did not support the church would find himself isolated socially and at risk spiritually. The church could declare you excommunicate, cutting you off from all sacraments. No communion, no confession, no marriage in the church, no Christian burial. Excommunication was social and spiritual death. No one would associate with you. You were marked as cursed. This threat kept most people compliant with church demands. Indulgences became a way to manage sin through payment. The church would grant forgiveness for sins in exchange for money or services. This was controversial even at the time, but it was also pragmatic. The church needed revenue. People needed forgiveness. The transaction served both parties. You might purchase an indulgence before going to war, ensuring that sins you would commit in battle were pre-forgiven. Or you might purchase them after, clearing your conscience of things you had done. The theological logic was complex, but the practical effect was simple. Money bought spiritual security. Death was ever present in medieval life. Disease, injury, violence, starvation, all killed people constantly. Children died young, often before age 5. Women died in childbirth regularly. Men died in accidents, in warfare, from illness. Everyone you knew had lost family members, friends, acquaintances. Death was normal, expected, unavoidable. You knew death was coming for you eventually. You just did not know when. This awareness shaped how you lived. Some people used it as motivation to squeeze pleasure from every moment. Others became fatalistic, accepting that they had little control over their fate. Most simply adapted to constant low-level anxiety about mortality. Religion offered structure for that uncertainty and for grief. Rituals for the dead helped survivors process loss. Funerals, prayers for the deceased, masses said for their souls. These rituals had practical psychological value even beyond their religious significance. They gave people something to do with their grief, a way to channel it into structured activity. The promise of afterlife was central to Christian belief. If you were good, if you died in a state of grace, you went to heaven. Eternal peace, reunion with loved ones who died before you, presence of God. This promise made earthly suffering bearable. Your pain was temporary. Reward was eternal. But getting to heaven required more than just dying. You needed to have been shriven, confessed, absolved. You needed to have performed sufficient penance. You needed to have lived virtuously enough. The requirements were complex and somewhat unclear. This ambiguity kept people anxious and dependent on church guidance. Purgatory was the middle ground, a place of temporary suffering where souls were purified before entering heaven. Most people expected to spend time in purgatory. It was better than hell, but still involved suffering. Your family could help reduce your time in purgatory by having masses said for your soul, by making donations on your behalf. This gave the living something to do for the dead. Faith offered more than fear. It provided meaning and purpose. Your suffering had reason. Your duty mattered beyond this life. Your loyalty would be rewarded in heaven if not on earth. Whether you truly believed this or simply wanted to believe, it was often unclear, even to yourself. But it helped. It made the hardship bearable. Miracles were believed in and reported regularly. Saints intervened in human affairs. Relics had power. Prayers were answered. Whether these things actually happened or were misinterpretations and coincidences did not matter practically. People believed they happened. That belief shaped behavior. You might pray to a particular saint for protection in battle. You might carry a relic, a piece of cloth that supposedly touched a saint's body, believing it would protect you. You might make pilgrimage to a holy site, seeking blessing or healing. These practices gave you sense of control, feeling that you could influence your fate through proper devotion. Superstition mixed freely with orthodox belief. Lucky charms, rituals to ward off bad luck, beliefs about omens and signs. The church officially discouraged superstition, but practically tolerated it. As long as people attended Mass and paid their tithes, minor superstitions were overlooked. Morality was tied directly to obedience. A good man was an obedient man. He followed church teaching, obeyed his Lord, fulfilled his duties, maintained his place in the hierarchy. Questioning these arrangements was not just socially unacceptable, it was spiritually dangerous. Independent thought was not valued. Conformity was safety. You learned to think what you were supposed to think, or at least to say that you did. Private doubts could exist, but they remained private. Expressing doubt publicly was dangerous. Heresy charges could result, with fatal consequences. The church provided education, health care such as it was, poor relief, and social services that no one else offered. It was genuinely useful beyond its spiritual role. This practical value reinforced its power. You needed the church for both spiritual and material reasons. Monasteries and conveyances offered refuge for those who could not or would not participate in secular life. Younger sons who would not inherit became monks. Widows became nuns. People seeking spiritual life removed themselves from secular concerns. These institutions provided stability in an unstable world. Belief softened uncertainty in important ways. When you did not understand why something happened, God's will was the answer. When you suffered, it was a test of faith. When you prospered, it was divine blessing. When someone died, it was their appointed time. This framework explained everything, which meant you never had to face the possibility that nothing had meaning at all. The alternative to belief was terrifying. If there was no God, no heaven, no ultimate justice, then suffering was meaningless. Your hardships had no purpose. Your death would be final erasure. The injustices you witnessed would never be corrected. This was unbearable to contemplate. So you believed, or you performed belief convincingly enough that no one could tell the difference. You went to Mass. You prayed. You confessed. You supported the church. You raised your children in faith. And you hoped that when your time came, it would be enough to save your soul from eternal torment. Chapter 8. Family and Legacy. Love was not a priority in marriage. It was barely a consideration. Marriages were alliances between families, exchanges of land and political connection, careful negotiations that benefited both sides. The individuals being married were participants in a transaction larger than themselves. Your marriage was likely arranged by your father or whoever headed your family. They would negotiate with other families of similar status, seeking advantageous matches. A marriage might bring land as dowry. It might secure military alliance. It might elevate your family status through connection to a more prominent family. These were the considerations that mattered. You met your wife perhaps a few times before the wedding, if at all. Some couples were introduced during negotiations. Others met at the wedding itself. You knew little about each other beyond the political arrangements that brought you together. Compatibility was luck, not design. The wedding was ceremony and feast, public display of the alliance being formed. Witnesses from both families attended. The marriage was blessed by a priest. Vows were exchanged. Everyone drank and ate and celebrated the political achievement. You and your new wife were secondary to the event. After the ceremony, you were expected to consummate the marriage. This was not romantic. It was obligation, necessary to legitimize the union and to begin producing heirs. The consummation might be publicly verified by witnesses examining bedsheets the next morning, particularly for important marriages where proof of virginity and consummation mattered politically. Some marriages developed into companionable partnerships over time. Husband and wife became allies in managing the estate, raising children, navigating the social world they inhabited. They learned each other's habits and preferences. They developed affection, maybe not romantic love, but genuine caring and respect. These marriages were fortunate. Other marriages remained cold, formal arrangements, where both parties lived largely separate lives under the same roof. They fulfilled minimum obligations. They produced children because that was required, but they shared little beyond necessity. These marriages were common and accepted as normal. A few marriages were actively miserable, couples who despised each other, trapped in legal bonds that could not be broken. Divorce was nearly impossible, requiring church annulment, which was difficult and expensive to obtain. Mostly, people endured bad marriages because they had no alternative. Violence in marriage was common and legal. A husband had right to discipline his wife physically, within limits that were vague and rarely enforced. Some men beat their wives regularly. Others never did. It varied by individual, not by social constraint. Women had little recourse except appealing to family or church, which rarely helped. Your wife's role was defined narrowly. She managed the household, oversaw servants, raised young children, maintained social connections with other noble women. If you were absent on campaign, she might administer the estate, but this was temporary. When you returned, you resumed control. Women's lives were constrained more than men's in nearly every way. They had less freedom of movement, less social power, less control over their own lives. Yet they were not powerless. Capable women found ways to exercise influence, managing estates effectively, advising husbands, manipulating social networks. Some became formidable despite constraints. Children were raised for specific roles determined by birth and gender from the moment they arrived. Sons were trained to become knights if the family could afford it, or to enter the church, or to learn estate management. Daughters daughters were prepared for marriage, taught skills that would make them acceptable wives to families of similar or higher status. You loved your children, probably, in the way people love their offspring. But that love was tempered by pragmatism and high childhood mortality. Many children did not survive past infancy. You learned not to become too attached to babies. You mourned losses but moved forward. There was no other choice. Sons began training early, following the same path you had followed. At 7 or 8, they were sent away to serve as pages in another lord's household. You saw them infrequently after that. Letters were rare and impersonal, reporting on progress and health, but not creating intimacy. Your relationship was distant by design. This distance was intentional and necessary. Your son needed to learn loyalty to his lord, not attachment to his father. He needed to be shaped by someone who could be objective about his failures. You were too invested in him to train him properly yourself, so you sent him away, trusting that he would be treated fairly and trained adequately. Daughters remained home longer, learning from their mothers how to manage households. They learned to supervise servants, to plan meals, to manage supplies and finances. They learned needlework, music sometimes, basic literacy, if the family valued education. Everything they learned was preparation for their future role as wives. Daughters were married strategically when older, usually mid-teens, sometimes younger. The marriage would be negotiated carefully, seeking the best alliance possible. A marriage to the right family could secure important connection, gain land, elevate your family's status. Your daughter was valuable, not for herself, but for what she could achieve through marriage. You cared about your daughter's welfare within the constraints of pragmatic necessity. You wanted her to be reasonably happy, to not be abused, to have an acceptable life. But her happiness was secondary to family advantage. If the best marriage available was to someone older or unpleasant, you would still arrange it. Her duty was to the family. Some daughters resisted marriages they did not want. Their resistance rarely succeeded. Parental authority was nearly absolute. The church supported parental decisions. A daughter who refused to marry as directed could be disowned, sent to a convent, cut off from family support. Most accepted what was arranged. Younger sons faced difficult prospects. Inheritance went to the eldest son under primogeniture. Younger sons received less or nothing beyond basic support. They needed to find their own way, becoming knights in service to other lords, entering the church, or living as dependents of their older brother. This system preserved estates and prevented fragmentation of holdings. If land was divided among all children, estates would splinter across generations, becoming too small to be viable. Primogeniture was harsh, but practical. It ensured continuity. The younger son situation created resentment sometimes. Brothers who had been raised together, who had similar training, found themselves in vastly different circumstances based solely on birth order. The elder inherited everything. The younger scrambled for position. This created tension in families. Inheritance was crucial to every family's future. Your land, your title, everything you had built or been given would pass to your eldest son when you died. This was your legacy, the thing that outlasted you. You worked to maintain and expand your holdings, thinking always about what you would leave behind. Land defined legacy more than anything else. A knight without land was diminished in status, dependent on service to lords for income. A knight with land could support himself, could pass something tangible to the next generation. Every decision about land, whether to buy more, sell some, improve what you had, was made thinking about future generations. You fought to acquire land when possible, to keep what you had, to expand if opportunity arose. Land was security, status, legacy. Everything else was temporary. Only land persisted across generations. Death planning was common and sensible. As you aged, you made arrangements. You ensured your will was clear, written and witnessed properly. You designated who would receive what, settling potential disputes before they could complicate matters after your death. You settled debts, resolved lingering conflicts, tried to leave affairs in order. This was not morbid behavior. This was responsible. Dying without clear plans meant your family would fight over what remained. Brothers would dispute inheritance. Creditors would compete for assets. Your estate could be torn apart by conflicts you should have prevented. Proper planning was duty to your heirs. Family survival mattered most, more than your individual comfort or happiness. You endured hardship so your children would have opportunity. You made sacrifices so the family name would persist. You accepted constraints and obligations because that was what maintained your family's position across generations. This was purpose beyond yourself. Your life mattered not just for what you experienced, but for what you made possible for those who came after. Your children, your grandchildren, the generations you would never meet. They would benefit from what you built or suffer from what you failed to build. Memory was the closest thing to immortality available. Great knights were remembered for a generation, perhaps two. Their deeds recounted in stories. Average knights were forgotten almost immediately, their names lost as soon as everyone who knew them died. But family remembered. Your children knew your name. Your grandchildren heard stories about you. For a few generations, you existed in memory, part of family history. And then you faded completely. The stories stopped being told. Your name was forgotten. You became no one. This was the best you could hope for. A few generations of memory. A few stories told after you were gone. Your land passing to your descendants. Your name spoken occasionally before it was forgotten forever. This was legacy. Brief, imperfect, but something. The alternative was worse. Knights who died young left nothing. No land passed on. No children to remember them. No stories to tell. They vanished completely, as if they had never existed. Your goal was to avoid this fate, to leave something behind, however small, however briefly remembered. You worked toward this throughout your life, marrying well, producing children, acquiring land, building reputation. All of it was preparation for the legacy you would leave. And when death came, you hoped you had done enough, that your children would be secure, that your name would persist, at least for a while. That was all you could ask for, to be remembered briefly, to leave your children better situated than you started, to have mattered, at least to a few people, at least for a short time. This was success. This was achievement. Everything else was just filling time until death. Chapter 9. Injury, aging, and death. The body kept meticulous, unforgiving score. Every battle, every fall, every hour spent in armor, it all accumulated. By middle age, most knights carried the evidence of their lives in chronic pain, limited mobility, and visible damage that never fully healed. Injuries accumulated relentlessly. broken bones from falls or combat that healed poorly because medical care was primitive. The bone might be set by someone with minimal training, splintered with wood, and left to heal on its own. Often, it healed crooked, leaving you with permanent changes to how you moved. Scars were everywhere. Combat left marks, blades cutting through flesh that healed but never looked the same. Accidents left their own contributions, burns from fires, wounds from handling animals or equipment. Your body became a map of everything that had happened to you. Joint pain was universal among older knights. Years of wearing armor destroyed joints over time. Shoulders suffered from supporting the weight of chainmail. Hips and knees degraded from riding horses constantly. Ankles and feet took damage from marching in armor. By 40, most knights moved with visible stiffness. Damaged tendons and torn muscles were common and permanent. No surgical repair existed. Once damaged, these structures healed with scar tissue that was less flexible, less strong. You adapted your movements around the damage, compensating, protecting injuries that never fully recovered. Impacts left permanent reminders even when bones did not break. Blows to the head caused recurring headaches, dizziness, changes in personality. We now recognize these as symptoms of traumatic brain injury. Then, they were just how some knights became after taking hits to the helmet. You accepted it as normal aging. Arthritis set in early from repeated stress and old injuries. Your joints swelled, became painful, limited range of motion. Cold weather made it worse. Mornings were agony until you worked through the stiffness. You learned to live with pain as constant companion. Medical care was limited in ways that are difficult for modern people to comprehend. There was no understanding of infection, no antibiotics, no proper surgery, no anesthesia beyond alcohol or herbs that barely helped. Treatment was based on tradition and superstition more than knowledge. Barbers performed surgery when it was necessary, which was terrifying. They had experience cutting hair and bleeding patients, so they were considered qualified to cut into bodies. Some were skilled through experience, many were not. You had no way to know which you were getting until it was too late. Priests offered prayers as medical treatment, which was considered legitimate health care. Divine intervention was believed to heal disease and injury. You accepted prayer alongside physical treatment, hoping one or both would work. Often, neither did. Folk remedies were tried without understanding why they might work, or if they worked at all. Poultices of herbs, mixtures drunk or applied to wounds, rituals performed to drive out disease. Some remedies had actual medicinal value. Most did nothing. A few made things worse. You had no reliable way to distinguish between them. Infections were common and frequently fatal. A minor wound could kill you if it festered. You would notice redness spreading from the injury, feel heat in the area. Then fever would set in. The wound would smell terrible. Pus would drain from it. Eventually, if the infection spread far enough, you died. This happened regularly. There was no effective treatment for serious infections. Wounds might be cauterized with hot metal, burning away infected tissue, which sometimes worked, but was agonizing. Amputation might be attempted if infection was in a limb, removing the infected part before it killed the whole person. Many died from the amputation itself. Amputations were performed without anesthesia beyond strong alcohol. You were held down by multiple people while the surgeons sawed through bone and cut through tissue. The pain was beyond description. Many people died from shock during the procedure. Those who survived faced blood loss that often proved fatal. If you survived amputation, you were permanently disabled. A missing limb meant you could no longer fight effectively, could not work as you had before. Your value decreased dramatically. You became dependent on family or charity. This was often worse than death for a knight whose identity was tied to capability. Broken bones were set and splintered, but they rarely healed straight or strong. A broken leg might leave you with permanent limp. A broken arm might never regain full strength or range of motion. Fingers broken in combat might heal bent or frozen in place. You adapted to the damage, learning to work around limitations. Spinal injuries from falls or being thrown from horses could paralyze, partially or completely. There was no treatment. If you were lucky, you regained some function over time. If you were not, you were bedridden for whatever time remained until complications or pneumonia killed you. Eye injuries were common from debris in combat or accidents. Losing an eye meant losing depth perception, making combat more dangerous. You learned to compensate, turning your head more to see better, protecting your remaining eye obsessively. Many knights fought with one eye, hearing damage accumulated from being near combat noise, especially if you were hit in the helmet repeatedly. Ringing in your ears became permanent. You lost ability to hear higher frequencies. Conversations became difficult. You asked people to repeat themselves constantly. This was just expected for older knights. Older knights often transitioned into advisory roles if they had sufficient status and if their mind remained sharp. You attended councils, offered guidance based on experience, helped plan campaigns you no longer fought in. This preserved your value, even as your body failed. But this transition required political skill and maintained relationships. If you had not built those connections while capable, you had no advisory role to transition into. If your advice was not valued, you had nothing to offer. Many knights found themselves without clear role as they aged. Some knights entered monasteries in old age. This was part retirement, part preparation for death. The church cared for those who could no longer care for themselves in exchange for donations of land or wealth. You spent your final years in prayer, in silence, removed from the world you had inhabited. Monastery life offered peace if you valued contemplation. Routine was simple. Meals were provided. Medical care, such as it was available. You were cared for until you died. For knights who had lived violent lives, this could be genuine respite. But for knights who defined themselves through action, monastery life was suffocating. You were separated from everything familiar, surrounded by monks whose concerns felt alien, waiting to die with nothing to do but pray. Some found peace. Others found only misery. Retirement, as modern people understand it, did not exist. You worked until you could not. Then you became dependent on family or church. There was no pension, no saving system that would support you. If you had not acquired enough land or wealth to live on, you were vulnerable. Death often came suddenly, despite chronic conditions. A fall from a horse that would have been minor when young became fatal when old. A fever that you would have survived at 30 killed you at 50. A wound that you had received before without serious issue became infected and fatal. You went to bed one night and did not wake up. Or you woke up but could not move, could not speak, paralyzed by stroke, and died hours or days later, while others watched helplessly. Or you simply weakened gradually, eating less, moving less, fading over weeks until your body stopped functioning. Few knights died gloriously in the way that songs described. The ideal of falling in battle, sword in hand, facing the enemy bravely, was rare. Most died in beds, sick and weak, far from anything resembling glory. They died of age, of disease, of accumulated damage from years of hardship. The end was usually quiet and unremarkable. You grew weaker. You stopped eating. You slept more. You became confused or delirious. Family members sat with you if you were fortunate. A priest administered last rites if one was available. And then you died, often in pain, usually alone in the ways that mattered. Your death affected your immediate family significantly, but few others. Your lord noted it, assigned your duties to someone else, moved on. Other knights acknowledged it briefly, then forgot. Peasants on your land continued their work under new management. The world adjusted to your absence in days. Graves were simple for most knights. A burial in the church, if you had sufficient status and your family could afford it. A grave in the churchyard if you had less. A marker with your name if your family could pay for one. Most graves were unmarked. Within a generation, no one remembered where you were buried. The earth reclaimed you quickly. Your body decayed in the grave. Your bones eventually scattered or dissolved. The physical fact of you disappeared completely within years. All that remained was memory, and that faded too. Your possessions were divided according to your will if you had made one, or according to inheritance law if you had not. Your armor went to your son or was sold to pay debts. Your horse was sold if it had value. Your weapons were distributed to heirs or sold. Everything you owned, everything you had maintained and protected and valued, became someone else's problem. You were reduced to inventory, a list of assets to be divided, a name in legal documents transferring property. You existed as administrative burden for a brief time while your estate was settled. And then even that ended. The living moved on quickly because they had to. There was no time for prolonged grief. Life continued with its demands. Your duties needed to be fulfilled by someone. Your role needed to be filled. Your family needed to adapt to your absence and continue functioning. Your name was spoken less and less frequently. At first, people mentioned you regularly, remembering things you did or said. But memories faded. Newer events replaced old ones. Within a few years, you were mentioned rarely. Within a decade, hardly ever. Within a generation, never. Your children remembered you, though their memories became simplified and selective over time. They told stories about you to their children, your grandchildren, but the stories were curated, highlighting certain aspects, omitting others, gradually transforming you into a character rather than a person. Your grandchildren knew you only through these stories. They never met you. Their image of you was constructed entirely from family narratives that might bear little resemblance to who you actually were. You became family legend, partially fictional, serving whatever purpose the stories needed you to serve. Within 2 generations, you were forgotten completely. Your great-grandchildren never heard your name. The stories stopped being told. Whatever you had accomplished, whatever you had endured, it all vanished from living memory. You became no one, indistinguishable from the countless others who also lived and died and were forgotten. This was the end that awaited everyone. Not glory, not legend, just absence. Your life, with all its struggles and small victories, reduced to nothing. The knowledge that this waited for you colored everything. You could not achieve immortality through memory. The best you could hope for was to be remembered briefly by people who would themselves be forgotten. And so you focused on what you could control, surviving each day, fulfilling your duties, maintaining your equipment and your relationships and your reputation, producing children who would carry on after you, acquiring land that would outlast you, even if your name did not. These were the realistic goals. Not glory or fame, but simple continuation. Your family line persisting, your land passing to your heirs, your obligations fulfilled satisfactorily. This was success. This was all that was achievable for an average knight. Conclusion. The truth about knighthood. Knighthood was duty, not adventure. It was obligation without end, service without glory, survival without certainty. From the moment you were sent away as a child to the moment you died, forgotten by everyone except those who inherited your responsibilities, your life was not entirely your own. You served because you were born to serve. The circumstances of your birth determined your path before you could walk. Your father was a knight, or your uncle, or some family connection meant you were destined for the same life. There was no choosing, no alternative presented. This was your role. You would fill it or bring shame on your family. You fought because you were ordered to fight, not because you wanted glory or believed deeply in causes. Sometimes the reasons made sense. Sometimes they were transparently about land or power or settling grudges between nobles. Either way, you went when called. You risked your life for reasons that rarely had much to do with you personally. You endured because there was no alternative. Complaining changed nothing. Refusing meant losing everything. Running away meant becoming an outcast, hunted, dying alone. So you endured the cold castles, the hunger on campaigns, the weight of armor, the grinding routine of peacetime. You endured because survival required endurance. Moments of battle were rare, brief, and chaotic. They were not the defining experiences of your life, despite what songs suggested. Most of your life was spent not fighting, maintaining equipment, standing guard, managing peasants, attending your lord, performing endless small duties that no one remembered or celebrated. The defining experiences, the ones that shaped you, were the ones no one commemorated. The hours spent working oil into chainmail links, fingers cold and stiff, doing boring work that kept you alive. The cold winters in drafty castles, huddled near fires that barely helped, counting days until spring. The hunger on long campaigns, eating less than you needed, weakening daily. The tedium of standing guard, watching empty rows for threats that never came. These experiences were common to every knight, universal and unmentioned. They did not make good stories. No one wanted to hear about maintenance or boredom or cold. People wanted to hear about battles and heroics, about glory that rarely actually happened. The reality was too mundane, too grinding, too much like ordinary hardship, rather than noble adventure. Routine defined existence more than any battle ever could. You woke, you worked, you ate whatever was available, you slept. Day after day, year after year. The rhythm was broken occasionally by violence or celebration or crisis, But those were exceptions. Most of your life was ordinary in ways that would bore anyone hearing about it. Yet within that routine, you built something. Not glory, but life. You maintained relationships. You fulfilled obligations. You passed on skills to the next generation. You survived long enough to have children, to acquire land, maybe, to leave something behind. This was achievement, even if songs never celebrated it. Honor was fragile, more fragile than most people realized. A single mistake could destroy a reputation built over decades. A moment of cowardice, real or perceived, could define you forever. You protected your honor not because you were inherently noble, but because losing it meant losing everything. Honor was survival in different form. Dishonor meant social death. No one would marry their children to yours. Other knights would avoid you. Opportunities would disappear. Your lord might dismiss you. Everything you had built could collapse because of one failure, one moment where you acted in a way that others judged unacceptable. So you guarded your reputation obsessively. You avoided situations where failure was likely. You ensured witnesses saw your successes. You cultivated relationships with people who could vouch for you. Managing honor was constant work, as demanding as any other part of being a knight. Survival was the true goal, the thing that mattered more than anything else. Not glory, not fame, not even duty truly. You wanted to survive, to see another spring, to live long enough to pass something on. Everything else was secondary to this fundamental drive. You did what you had to do to keep living. You obeyed even when you disagreed. You fought even when you were afraid. You endured discomfort that seemed unbearable. You adapted to circumstances that should have broken you, all because you wanted to survive. This was not weakness or failure. This was human. You were not a legendary hero. You were a man trying to survive in a world that did not care about you. The fact that you succeeded at all was achievement. The fact that you fulfilled your obligations while surviving was extraordinary, even if no one recognized it. The legend outlived the reality by centuries. The stories told about knights bore almost no resemblance to the lives they actually lived. Knights in songs were noble, brave, always honorable. They rescued the innocent, won glory, lived adventurously. None of this matched reality. But the legend persisted because people wanted to believe in something greater. They wanted to believe that honor mattered more than survival, that glory was achievable, that duty was noble rather than grinding. The truth was too hard, too mundane, too close to the ordinary hardships everyone experienced. The legend served a purpose. It made the system work by convincing people that their suffering had meaning, that their sacrifices mattered. Knights endured hardship because they believed they were part of something important. The legend maintained that belief even when reality contradicted it. The truth was simpler and harder. Knights were men doing a job in a world that did not care about them individually. They served because they had to. They suffered because suffering was inherent to the job. They died and were forgotten because that was what happened to everyone. They were not heroes in the way stories portrayed. They were people caught in systems larger than themselves, fulfilling roles assigned at birth, doing what they could to survive and provide for families. Sometimes they acted nobly, sometimes they did not. Mostly, they acted practically, doing what seemed necessary at the time. And yet, Within this framework of obligation and hardship, they lived. They formed relationships, found moments of joy, created meaning where they could. They loved their children, even if they rarely saw them. They found companionship with other knights who understood what they endured. They took pride in work done well, in equipment properly maintained, in duties faithfully fulfilled. This was enough. It had to be enough. There was no alternative available. You could not escape knighthood once you were trained for it. You could not change the system. You could only live within it as best you could, finding whatever meaning or satisfaction was available, surviving until you could not survive anymore. The average knight, the forgotten one whose name we do not know, lived this life. He was born into it, trained for it, performed it adequately, if not brilliantly. He experienced fear and pain and boredom. He did things he was proud of and things he regretted. He aged, weakened, and died. He was buried and forgotten. His life mattered to him, to his family, to the few people who knew him personally. Beyond that small circle, he was invisible. History did not record him. Songs did not celebrate him. He was one of thousands just like him, indistinguishable from the mass. But he lived. He experienced the world in his own way. He had hopes and fears and dreams, even if most remained unfulfilled. He was as real and complete a person as anyone who has ever lived. The fact that we forgot him does not diminish that he existed. This was the average life of a medieval knight. Not the legend, the reality. And the reality was this: duty performed daily, obligation fulfilled consistently, survival achieved through endurance, and ultimately, inevitable forgotten death. That was what knighthood actually meant. Everything else was story. Outro: imagine the castle at night now. The fires have died down to glowing embers. The great hall is nearly empty, except for a few servants preparing for tomorrow. Most have retired to their sleeping quarters, seeking whatever rest they can find. Somewhere in a small room shared with others, a knight's armor rests on its stand, waiting for morning. The metal is dull from years of use, marked by scratches and repairs that tell stories no one remembers. The chainmail has been recently oiled, each link inspected as it has been inspected thousands of times before. The leather straps have been checked for wear. Everything is ready for another day. The knight himself sleeps in a narrow bed nearby, wrapped in rough blankets that do not quite keep out the cold. His body aches in familiar places, old injuries making themselves known. He has been asleep for hours. Will wake before dawn. Will begin again the routines that define his existence. His life is not remarkable. He is not famous. His name will be forgotten shortly after he dies. But tonight, he sleeps, and tomorrow he will wake and do what he has always done. He will check his equipment. He will fulfill his duties. He will survive another day if he is fortunate. And that will be enough. It has to be enough. There is nothing else. The castle is quiet now. Outside, the world is dark and still. Inside, people sleep, preparing for another day in a time we can barely imagine. Living lives we can only reconstruct from fragments. The knight sleeps. His armor waits. Morning will come, and the cycle will continue, as it always has, as it always will, until the day it finally ends. Rest now. Let the weight of history settle. Let the truth of these lives, these forgotten lives, sit with you. They deserve to be remembered, even if only briefly, even if only by us, looking back across centuries of distance. The story is finished. The knight sleeps. And somewhere, in our own time, we carry forward the knowledge of what life was actually like for people who lived and died in a world nothing like our own. Sleep well.